India's international trade. David Andrews.
I'm Taylor Johnson.
And I'm Katie Reichman.
India's foreign trade policy. Regional and bilateral trade agreements. India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. The Indo-Sri Lanka Trade Agreement was signed in 2000, and then up until 2004, the trade had rose to 128% and quadrupled by 2006, reaching in US dollars $2.6 billion. Negotiations are also underway to expand the free trade agreement to forge stronger commercial relations and increase corporate investment and ventures in various industries. The year 2010 is predicted to be the best year for the bilateral trade on record, with Sri Lanka's exports to India increasing by 45% over the first 7 months of the year. India also has trade agreements with Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, China, and South Korea, and all are part of the South Asia Free Trade Agreement, also known as SAFTA. In 1950, India and Nepal signed a treaty of peace and friendship that allowed them to trade openly with each other, to the point where the border is open and they may travel freely across the border without passports or visa and may live and work in either country. The Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or CECA, with Singapore was drafted and signed on June 29th of 2005. This landmark agreement is India's first ever CECA and Singapore's first ever comprehensive bilateral economic agreement with a South Asia economy. It also marks the first time that Singapore has included taxation agreement discussions in the process. Framework agreements with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, aims to complete all its free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand by 2013, in line with the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community by 2015. The World Bank has been specifically involved in India as of late, focusing on specialized analysis for specific subjects that are requested by the government, as well as working with the Ministry of Commerce and providing better information for India's policymakers so that they may increase their economy. Various reports that have been based on this are Sustaining India's Services Revolution, Access to Foreign Markets, Domestic Reforms, and International Negotiation. Another report is From Competition at Home and Competing Abroad, the Case of Horticultural in India.
Next, we're going to be talking about intra-industry trade within India. In the early 1980s, there was economic liberalization, which allowed for commodity structure of international trade. Two main changes were observed throughout the world based on these manufacturing commodity changes. The first is the level of multilateral intra-industry trade. This is referencing the importance of exports in regards to imports and influencing changes. The second point is the influence of country-specific factors on the intensity of India's intra-industry trade with major trading partners. Labelizing policy environment has allowed for trade expansion towards intra-industry trade. This is happening because of an allocation of resources within specific industry. Also, increased intra-industry trade is largely export-led, and the reason for the picture on the right is that gold is one of India's largest exports. India has a distinguished intra-industry trade from other industrialized countries. Overall, there's a greater level of complementary intra-industry trade. For example, they're allowed to do simultaneous imports and exports. They have less intra-industry trade with countries that are at similar levels of economic development, and there is more intra-industry trade with high-income countries as opposed to middle or low-income countries. Because India trades with high-income countries, this means that India has vertical intra-industry trade, which is the exchange of commodities between unequal partners. Intra-industry trade strength is increasing while countries become less similar in income distribution. Industry-specific factors influence the intensity of intra-industry trade, and this is significant in India's international trade. This next graph highlights India's main exports, and as you can see, they're mostly agricultural goods. The last graph that I'd like to show compares the world price for certain products as compared to India's. Because India's population is mostly low average income, people are concerned about consumers not being able to afford prices, which would allow them to have to purchase imported items, mostly agricultural items, as opposed to exports. Fortunately, the proposed subsidies benefit the poorer people, which allows for a redistribution of wealth. There are new proposed policy adjustments to help the agricultural trade within India. The first would be to remove trade restrictions. This imposed direct taxes on agricultural producers also should be eliminated. This must be done to prevent a quick and large increase in agricultural prices, and by doing this slowly, they are preventing free exports. And this allows for the necessary gap between foreign and domestic prices. Next, Katie is going to talk to you about India's changing trade pattern in the process of globalization.
Among several features of globalization, one relates to increasing interactions among nations and removal of barriers to facilitate movement of goods, capital, labor, and technology. The rapid integration of India, Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa into the world market was a key element of globalization. World trade is primary manifestation of this integration and changing organizational structure of the world economy. Foreign trade has become an essential component of most countries' economic activities. Over the years, emerging economies such as India, China, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and South Africa have come forth as new key drivers of global growth. India and China are the fastest growing economies, and India with its distinct development will be able to influence economic activities of the global economy in the years to come. India has a very high rate of merchandise trade growth compared with per capita income, and it plays a pivotal role among developing economies in global trade. The graph pictured here shows the compound annual growth rate of India's trade versus the world trade. Unlike value, compound annual growth rate of merchandise trade has been much higher than that of the world. India's compound annual growth rate in merchandise trade has declined from 9% during 1990 to 1995 to 8% during 1995 to 2000. There was a significant increase of 21% in the subsequent period from 2000 to 2005. The graph pictured here shows exports from India regionally. The bulk of India's exports were directed to developed economies from the 1990s until 2000. The share of manufactured goods in India's export is similar to that of global exports. Agricultural, raw materials, and fuels have been recorded lower proportional share in India's export as compared to world export. Southeast Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent State countries experienced a sharp fall in their share of India's export from 17% to a mere 2% from 1990 to 2005, which is a result of language barriers, distance, inappropriate transit, and lack of regular and direct interaction. The graph pictured here shows imports to India regionally. Based on the graph, it is evident that Europe is the main importer to India, followed by Southeast and Southwest Asia. In line with the trend in export, import of goods has increased in comparison to services. Imports are also heavily dominated by manufactured goods, with certain fluctuations in percent share. So in conclusion, political and economic reforms over the past 10 years have paved the way for developing India into a truly global marketplace. Similar to export, the proportion of Indian import emanating from developed economies has declined over the years. Manufactured goods and all food items accounts for around 88% in India's export. For India to be a key player in global trade along with export, it is also required to facilitate those imports which are necessary to fuel Indian economy. It is clear that India has been successful to a certain extent in diversifying its trade partners as well as commodity structure, reflecting the improving competitiveness of India in the world market.
Presumably this aspect of trade is helped by the fact that India has so many overseas resident populations that can help to facilitate trade. Is that right?
Well, clearly. I mean, a lot of this trade, I mean, Simon did mention this earlier, trade with the UAE, for example, is dominated by the emigrant Indians that reside there. Similarly, like Africa or other parts of the world, I mean, there is a huge amount of Indian population that lives across the world, and that does facilitate trade with those countries.
I think another point, if I may, that I find very interesting about India is if you look at some of the larger companies that are Indian companies, they're still actually run by the first generation or the second generation of the promoter. So there's very much in these very large companies still an entrepreneurial spirit at the top. And that makes these companies more, maybe potentially more explorative than and inquisitive than maybe large multinationals that are not don't have that entrepreneurial spirit. So I think Indian companies are very prone to not sitting at home as much as you might think, but to go out and look at opportunities and explore opportunities in new markets because of that entrepreneurial flair that still exists.